It's 2 o'clock. We're checked in the hotel.
Yeah,
that's a hard day. And it's flying back east was just fun. For some reason, you know, I would do that. We went to Jackson. How much?
So there's something about this is my last.
Yeah. So what's the total? It's the whole day, over day. New York. 20 hours by the time. Johannesburg, play over there. Just you're always almost and you get
sí, ese es como el punto central de inicio.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay, we're live.
I just want to know
I'm sure. Yeah, but I don't
I don't know that the structure of the floor changes.
So, good afternoon. Thank you for making it here. Teacher is absent because he's out of town, so he wants to introduce Diego, but he had this compromise from before. We decided that Diego will come here. So, thanks to funding from the Latin American Center and from TCP and from the Department of Anthropology, we have the opportunity to bring Professor Quiroga to the department, and he will talk today about the Galapagos Island. But he's been working for many years, so he's the Vice President of Research at the Universidad de San Francisco. That is the most important university in Ecuador, and one of the best universities also in Latin America. That is a program, they have a program that is very similar to the American universities. He's been working also in research with collaboration with different disciplines, as a matter of fact. And Diego works also in medical anthropology, and he also created a project of historical ecology with Professor Peter Estrada and Florencio Delgado, setting up, and I was involved in the project the last year. We hope to continue for the next years. So I'll let you with him. And he graduated actually from University of Illinois, PhD, and bachelor's from Berkeley, and he has a record of publication present, and also have a recent book from 2016 on Darwin, an edited volume that is critical in relation to the Galapagos course. So
thank you. Okay. Thanks, Augusto. Thank you for everyone who has made it possible for me to be here. Betty, Augusto, and all the departments that helped sponsor my coming here. Very glad to be here, and I think there's a lot of interest in doing more things in Ecuador and in the area. The university that I work for is a relatively, well, we used to be a small university. We have around now like 8,000 students and private university. So we also have a station in the Galapagos, and we work with the University of North Carolina with the Galapagos Science Center. So I'll be talking about the end a bit about that, what we do. So I'm going to do, I didn't know how to prepare this talk, but I think I'm going to do more like a very general talk about the Galapagos, so kind of cover, and then if there's questions at the end, I'll be glad to answer, if I can, some of the more specific questions. So I'm going to do a very general presentation of the Galapagos. First of all, the Galapagos are volcanic islands. As many of you know, I don't know if it was a word, but usually the big difference between volcanic and continental islands. So the Galapagos basically have never been attached to any major continent, and they are isolated, meaning that every animal and every species that has to go there has to travel through around 1,000 kilometers of ocean, and that's a filter. That's what they call a biological filter. Not everything can make it there. So you have a lot of reptiles in the Galapagos, a lot of different species of reptiles. You don't have any amphibians, or there shouldn't be any amphibians. As we'll see later, there are some amphibians, and that's a problem. But there shouldn't be any amphibians in the Galapagos. So that's what we call disharmonic biota, the fact that you have a kind of a distribution of animals and plants that are different from the ones in the mainland. So there's some occur, and that's true of many oceanic islands. So there's a hotspot in the Galapagos. That the hotspot is, as I say, like 600 miles from the mainland. The plates are moving. The plates are moving more or less around 4 or 5 centimeters towards South America. So the Galapagos eventually go towards the other plate, the South American plate. They are in the Nazca plate, and they'll sink and they'll disappear. So they are kind of moving and eroding as they move towards the east. Another thing that's very important to keep in mind. Some of these slides are in English, but I'll try. So we have also in Spanish, but so we have also some currents that is important to keep in mind. This is very important because if you think of the Galapagos, they are very weird in a way. There's islands that are right in the equator, and they have penguins. Shouldn't be there. So you have a kind of a weird distribution of animals, and that a lot of that has to do with these ocean currents. So you have one current that comes from the north, the Panama current. You have a cold current that's usually called the Peruvian or Humboldt current. It brings cold waters. And then you have another very important current that's called the Cromwell current, also with a lot of cold water. This is an undercurrent. And they crash against the islands and the Cromwell current, and they brings a lot of upwelling. They bring a lot of nutrients. So it's very rich with nutrients. So the Galapagos is, in that sense, a very unique ecosystem, as I said before, and has a lot of different environments in the Galapagos because of these currents. Throughout the year, also, the intensity of these currents change. So starting more or less at the end of May, but especially in June, all the way till November and December, the cold current, the cold rich currents become very strong. And there's a lot of upwelling, the water, the conditions become dry on land. And then more or less in January, February, more tropical conditions prevail. So throughout the year, there's this different environment, there's these different weathers, and that's very important to understand the Galapagos. And of course, every now and then you have a big El Nino, which, as we know now, has really transformed the evolution of animals and plants in the Galapagos. So El Nino has huge effects. Just to give you an example, the 82, 83 El Nino killed like 90% or more, like 95% of the corals. They kill like 50% or so of the marine animals and the sea lions, and a lot of animals died during El Nino. Whereas terrestrial animals like the finches, they really have a good time during El Nino because there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of food. Like finches usually reproduce around once a year. During El Nino, they go crazy. They reproduce like 10, 12 times a year. They have fun. So there's these warm conditions that really transform the terrestrial part with more rain and more warm conditions. So we have this idea of, one of the things that you have in these oceanic islands is that you have a rapid evolutionary processes. You know, animals go there, they find empty niches, they go crazy from a biological point of view, and we'll see some effects of that. But this idea of animals really evolving in a very fast biological way. And that, as you know, is what inspired Darwin. That's one of the things that we'll see that really made Darwin start thinking of evolution. And when he went to the Galapagos, and it's not only the Galapagos, usually the Galapagos is a myth in a way, because we think that Darwin, and I'll talk a bit about this Darwin myth in the Galapagos, but in a way the Galapagos was part of a series of islands that really inspired Darwin in thinking about evolution and all that. There's a lot of endemic animals. There's in some cases like reptiles and land birds and all that. Endemism is really high. We have not a lot of biodiversity in islands, but we have a lot of endemism. And the Galapagos is a good example. With many of the reptiles are endemic. I don't have a picture here, but recently, 4 or 5 years ago, they even discovered. So there's marine iguanas, there's land iguanas. There used to be like 15 species of tortoises, 14, but now we discover new ones. So there used to be like, now we used to have 15 species of tortoises, then the number went down because of, as I will see, whalers and pirates and colonists. So the number went down to 11. Then as tortoises, as some of you know, Lonesome George died, and then the number went down to 10. But last year they discovered, using genetic means, they discovered a new species. So now with the one, so number fluctuates. And there's even discussions whether they're really a species or not, and things like that. One of the things that you have in these oceanic islands is because of the fact that only few animals make it there, they're very special, evolving in these very special ecosystems. You have very few of them, so they're very vulnerable, some of these animals. This is one of my favorite examples of evolution, the flightless cormorant of the Galapagos. These animals, as in many oceanic islands, there's a lot of flightless birds. And in the Galapagos, the best example is the cormorant. So they went to the Galapagos from Peru probably around 1.5 million years ago. They lost their capacity to fly, and so they are very big, but they cannot fly. But they're very good divers. One professor at USFQ who works with them, they reported that they can go down to 40, 45 meters. So they're amazing divers. They don't know how to fly though. And you have the penguins, one of the smallest species, and they're the only one who lives north of the equator. So there's penguins, lava gulls, and other animals. But you can see the numbers, and I'm missing one. That's the mockingbird. But the numbers are really small. Some of these, like the mangrove finch, is in the brink of disappearing. So some of these animals that we have in the Galapagos, they're really endangered. They're really in a very few numbers. They're the only ones in the world, and they are very specific environments. So things like climate change, oil spills, and things like that can really affect the population of these animals. So, so that's a bit about the biology. We can talk more later if you have questions. But let me talk a bit about human history. Contrary to other Polynesian islands in Hawaii, we're talking about this, and the Easter Island, we don't have any evidence. Unless something happens in the next years. But we don't have any evidence of pre-Hispanic contact. There's no evidence of pre-European contact in the Galapagos. There has been no findings of people coming before the Spaniards arrived. So as far as we know, the first people to arrive to the Galapagos and settle in the Galapagos were Europeans and then Ecuadorians, but no evidence of people originally going. There's some myths, like the Incas had these myths about these islands in the ocean, and we are not sure if they were talking about the Galapagos or not. We're not sure if they actually colonized the Galapagos or whether they stayed. All we know is that when the Spaniards arrived, there's no recording and there's no evidence of people actually living in the Galapagos. So the Incas, as you probably know, they had, and the pre-Incas also, and people like the Manteños in Ecuador, they had the capacity of traveling very long distance. So it's not inconceivable that originally people from South Africa could have been there. As Thor Heyerdahl, for those who are my age or around my age, probably know who Thor Heyerdahl was. Young people never know who Thor Heyerdahl was. But this is a guy who was talking about people from South America going to the Pacific, but there's no real evidence of that actually happening so far. Well, so the first people to go to the Galapagos were the Spaniards. This guy, Tomás de Berlanga, who was going from Panama, he was traveling down to Peru. He basically did it during January, February, and he ran out of wind, and he ended up in the Galapagos. And he didn't like it very much. He says, it looks like God was spitting rocks and stuff here in this very ugly place to be. So as soon as he could, he got out of the Galapagos. Pretty soon, other Spaniards went to the Galapagos, like Diego de Rivadeneira. They didn't find anything interesting. You know, there's no gold, there's nothing that would interest them. So they also got out. They called them the Enchanted Island. And today, tour companies use the name to mean the wonderful islands, the beautiful. But that's not what they meant. They meant the spooky islands. They meant like the devil must be around. These islands are not the best place to be. So they were not using enchanted and encantadas. It was more like a negative term. And also they called them the Galapagos based on the shape of the carapace, the shell of the tortoises that remind them of a horse saddle. Galapagos, the old name for a horse saddle. So that's how the islands got their name. And then Ortelius, the Dutch guy, put them in the map as the Galapagos, the island of the horse saddles, like yes, or something like that. Then, well, since the Spaniards didn't like it, the private pirates and the privateers went there. And there's a big difference between a pirate and a privateer. Pirates and privateers, they basically do the same thing. They go, they rob, they rape, they burn. But privateers had the right to do it, right? Because they were fighting for the King of England or the Queen of England. Or so they went there. And one of the first and most interesting privateers to ever go to the Galapagos, this guy, William Dampier. William Dampier, well, some people call him the first naturalist to go to the Galapagos. He was basically a guy who traveled around the world, described New Holland, today better known as Australia. He writes books. So this guy was killing and raping and burning in the morning. In the afternoon, he was writing poetry and books and things like that. So he goes to the Galapagos. He's the inspiration for James Cook, inspiration for Alexander von Humboldt, a very famous explorer, German explorer who also went to the Galapagos. And finally for Darwin, if you read Darwin journals, he quotes Dampier all the time. He really was impressed by Dampier. So Dampier was describing animals and looking at the different kind of species that you can find. Very interesting guy. Dampier went with another guy called Coley, and Coley makes the first map of the Galapagos. As you can see, this is not a very accurate map, but that was the first map ever made of the Galapagos. And one thing you can notice in this map is that the islands have different names. So one name, for example, this island, which is Floreana, the first name given to that island was Santa Maria by the Spaniards. Then the British called it King Charles Island. And then the Ecuadorians call it Floreana after the first president of Ecuador. So some of these islands have 2, 3 names that are given to them. So it's kind of confusing because some of the textbooks and the guidebooks and all that, they use one name and then the other. So you kind of have to know at least the 2 or 3 names of each island. So these are the islands that were given. After the pirates went there, we start having the time when the whalers went. So more or less around the 18th century, it was a lot of whalers. First were British whalers, but during the British-American War in 1812, a U.S. captain went and they pretty much destroyed all the British whaling ships. So it became mostly American whalers from Massachusetts. So it was a lot of American whaling ships that went there. They were going there to catch sperm whales. So all the way during the 18th century, sperm whales were going, whalers were going there for that reason. One thing that whalers were interested in, and pirates were interested in, and then later Ecuadorians were very interested in, was tortoises. They were going to get tortoises because tortoises was one of the few sources of meat that can be eaten fresh during because tortoises can live for a very long time almost without being fed, and so they can last for almost a year. And so they would take tortoises alive and they would eat these poor animals as they would go traveling around. Even Charles Darwin in the Beagle, they ate 17 tortoises and as they were going. And the mistake that Charles Darwin made, he later realized, is that he threw all the carapace, he threw all the shell back to the water, so they didn't have evidence when he went back to England, and that was very important for. But this, so during the 18th century, it was mostly people from the outside going to the Galapagos and taking some of the things. Another thing that happens during the 18th century that's very important with these visitors, so we're talking about the whalers and the pirates, is that they introduce some animals. So some of there were rats and goats and pigs. All those were introduced starting in the 17th and 18th century. So very early we have evidence that rats and pigs and maybe dogs were introduced early during those times. So we have some evidence about that. Well, then Charles Darwin goes, of course, the most famous visitor of the Galapagos. Charles Darwin was going around the world, and mostly the Beagle was doing mapping the coast of South America. So the main purpose of the boat was to map the coast of South America. Charles Darwin originally didn't go like the naturalist. Many people think that Charles Darwin went as a naturalist. He was not. He was the companion to Fitzroy. Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, was very afraid because the previous captain of the Beagle had killed himself out of depression when he was going down there. So Fitzroy, who eventually kills himself, was afraid that he was going to be very alone and no one to talk to and things like that. Never mind 80 crew members at that time. You know, those were not people you can have an intelligent conversation with. So he takes Charles Darwin, a Cambridge graduate, along with him to be his companion. They map the south coast of South America, and as you probably know, Charles Darwin had a problem, and it was seasickness. Charles Darwin was always seasick. And so he spends a lot of time, out of the 5, he writes in the Journal of the Beagle, he writes, "I hated every wave of the ocean." This poor guy was very sick all the time. So he out of the 5 years that the trip takes around the world, he spends almost 1.5 years, only 1.5 years on the boat, and the rest he was on land. Here he sees a lot of fossilized evidence. He sees an earthquake in Chile also that really impresses him. He was reading Charles Lyell at the time, kind of talking about the Earth being very old and all the geological processes. And he goes to the Galapagos in September. He lands in a place that's very close to where we have our campus, actually. It's only like 200-300 meters from where we have our station and our campus. And Charles Darwin, the myth of Charles Darwin, right? The myth of Charles Darwin a bit goes like this. Charles Darwin goes to the Galapagos as a creationist. He sees the finches. He immediately understands that there's evolution going on. He leaves the Galapagos. He's an evolutionist. That didn't happen that way. There's a guy at Berkeley, Frank Salloway, that in the 80s did a very good job in debunking what we call the Darwin myth. So basically, Charles Darwin goes to the Galapagos. He only is in the Galapagos for around 5 weeks. He only visits 4 islands. So it's not a lot of time, and he misses the finch. He did a very poor job collecting the finches and reclassifying the finches. It was other people and the other members of the boat that really do a much better job with the finches. Later, Charles Darwin takes the finch collection to Cambridge, and a guy called John Gould reclassifies the finches and tells him these are all finches. At first, he didn't even realize they were all finches. So there's a reclassification process going on. So it's not so much the finches, but the mockingbirds that make Darwin think. So one of the first animals that really got Darwin thinking about evolution, because as you probably know, at that time, the idea was that God created the species and they don't change, and that they are immutable. So that it was the mockingbirds, and later the tortoises. He had a conversation with the guy who was at the time the governor of the Galapagos, who tells him he can see where the different tortoises come just by looking at the different shapes of the carapace. So that makes Darwin think about these different animals are evolving in these different islands. So that's he brings that, and he starts talking about that later in his writings. Now, I'm not saying the finches are not very interesting. Finches are, as you know, a wonderful example of adaptive radiation, but no wonder Darwin kind of missed the finches. Look how different their beaks are. Some have specialized in just 1.5 million years. Some are seed eaters, cactus eaters, insect eaters. So, and some of them, and Darwin didn't realize this. They didn't know this until the 1960s. Some of them have become woodpeckers, so they have learned how to use tools. And some of them now, and a professor of us studying them, have become vampires. So there's even vampire finches in the Galapagos, in some of the islands like Wolf, which is very difficult to reach. So even until the middle of the 20th century, they hadn't really realized that there was such thing as vampire finches. After Darwin goes, and the reason I'll connect all of these ideas with what's going on today in the Galapagos, but after Darwin goes, the Galapagos becomes known as a laboratory of evolution, in part because of Darwin writings, and the Galapagos becomes world known as a laboratory of evolution. So this creation of this construct of the Galapagos as a laboratory of evolution starts to become powerful one in the 18th and late 18th century. One guy that you probably have heard of, Luis Agassiz, who was at Harvard, and he goes in 1873, basically to disprove Darwin. He was basically obsessed, and this, as you know, is a very well-known scientist of the 19th century, a Swiss-born American scientist, and he was obsessed with disproving Darwin. He was a creationist. He thought that Darwin teachings were going to lead towards the end of Western values and civilization. So he's very upset with Darwin and his teaching. So he goes to the Galapagos actually to disprove Darwin. Other people like this guy Bauer, a very interesting guy, a Lamarckian, and he goes there to disprove Darwin in a different way. His idea, and this was not an uncommon idea at the time, was that these oceanic islands actually were not oceanic islands. This is the idea of a land bridge. So there was in the 19th century, this is way before plate tectonics, right? There were ideas that these islands at one point were actually connected, or that there was a whole platform that has subsided, that have sunk, and that these islands actually were not oceanic islands, but that the animals were actually like the tortoises. How can you explain tortoises getting there? It was because there were these land bridges that connected the islands. So there was all these ideas that were against Darwin and his teachings, and that would, of course, imply that evolution was not going on, and that there was other processes and not evolutionary processes. So many of these guys. One interesting guy also is a guy, Rollo Beck, that goes with the California Academy of Science. We'll talk about this a bit later. I'm just reading a book that just came out this year called Collecting Evolution, and that's about the California Academy of Science expedition in 1905, 1906. Well, so this is the 19th century. Well, these things are going on. So one thing is that the Galapagos is being created as a myth, as an evolutionary laboratory. This is the construct that's being built of the Galapagos. At the same time, Ecuador starts settling the Galapagos. So in the 1833, the first colonists go there. At that time, no one in their right mind would want to go and live in the Galapagos. So most of the people who went and lived in the Galapagos were actually prisoners, people who had problems with the law. So a guy called Villamin, interesting guy, he was born in Louisiana, a French guy, then became American, then eventually Ecuadorian, so he had like 4 nationalities. He's sent by the Ecuadorian government to settle the Galapagos, and he has some of the first, in Floreana, he puts the first settlement of the Galapagos. We've been working on this, like Augusto also has been working on this. Juan Manuel Cobos. Juan Manuel Cobos was an interesting guy. He was, some people say from Guayaquil, other people say he came from the south of Ecuador. He started with collecting a lichen that was used in the dye industry. But later he creates a whole industry in the Galapagos. He puts a sugarcane plantation. He was interesting guy. He was in the middle of the Galapagos. Suddenly he was bringing all these huge machines from the United States, from England. He was building this incredible industry in the middle of nowhere. We think part of what he was doing actually was contraband and trying to do moonshining or something like that. And then, but he creates all this empire in the Galapagos. He puts a coffee tree plantation also. There's still coffees that they say. But he had, at that time, there was a very traditional way of dealing with workers, with this hacienda system where workers were treated almost like slaves. So he kind of was treating the workers in a very bad way. He was abusing the workers in many ways. I've been reading some stories about him. So he would abandon the workers if they really misbehaved. He would abandon them in different islands for them basically to starve or to die without water. So he's not a very nice guy. So in 1904, some of the workers rebelled and killed him. And that was kind of the end of this plantation, and they start creating their own fincas, their own farms. So we've been excavating here from Canada, from Victoria, and some people from USFQ. We've been excavating the hacienda of one of the things we're interested in looking at is what were the effects, because this is a very interesting situation in which we have kind of a baseline where humans first go there and do major transformations. So there's not many places on the earth where you know exactly when humans arrive and colonize a place. So in that sense, is a lot of things to learn in the Galapagos also from human occupation, how the environment is transformed in just 100, 150 years. So we're doing phytolite analysis and other analysis to try to understand this process of transformation. As I mentioned to you, in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, one of the things that I think is fascinating about the Galapagos is that it shows how the world biology was changing and how ideas about conservation were changing. So at that time, we're talking about the beginning of the 19th century. Conservation meant putting things on alcohol and conserving them for new generations to be able to study them, literally. So the California Academy of Science sends a bunch of 8 scholars, 8 scientists, young guys, who go to the Galapagos. And basically, they had as the main mandate to collect as much as they could and bring them back to California. At the same time, there was the fire in California, in San Francisco, that the whole the California Academy of Sciences burned and is destroyed basically by the 1906 earthquake and fire. And they bring what is today the founding collection of animals and plants in the California Academy of Science. And still, believe it or not, people are still using it for studying like avian diseases and things like that. So it's a very interesting collection. The guys who go there, these 8 scientists, they eventually become very influential people in science in the United States. But they were not, most of them were not Darwinian again. They were still not believing in Darwin. They're still, Darwin doesn't become like the main paradigm until more like in the 1930s or so. So this is the pre-Darwinian kind of paradigm gets established as the main paradigm in science, in biology. So they were collecting, and they were also sponsored by the California Academy of Science, who wanted to get more of the collection. So basically, with the modern synthesis of biology is when the Darwinian discourse became very important. And then this also influences conservation. So it's only in the 1930s that what we consider today to be conservation, in situ conservation, starts. So the first laws against hunting started in the 1930s in the Galapagos. The Ecuadorian government put some of these laws. And some of these very famous scientists like Eidesfeld and Huxley, the grandson of Julian Huxley, the grandson of Thomas Huxley, the bulldog of Darwin, they start putting pressure on Robert Dolman. They start putting pressure on the Ecuadorian government, and the UNESCO is created, and they create the first laws for conservation. As in 1959, 100 years after the writing of the Origin of the Species, 150 years after Darwin's birth, that the Charles Darwin Foundation is created in the Galapagos National Park. And the Ecuadorian government declares, and the Ecuadorian government declared 97% of the islands as a protected territory. So in 1959, most of the Galapagos is protected. Today, most of the land area of the Galapagos is a protected territory. So it's protected. And then in 1978, the Galapagos is one of the first places to be put in the UNESCO World Heritage List. So it's in 1998 is another very important year, because the special law for the conservation of the Galapagos is created. That basically what it does, among other things, is that it stops people from migrating to the Galapagos. So the Galapagos, although it's part of Ecuadorian territory, you cannot, I as an Ecuadorian, and I think some of us are Ecuadorians, we cannot just go there and move there and start a business or build a house or whatever. There's only people born in the Galapagos, basically, or people who marry a Galapagueño or a Galapagueña. Many other students try that with mixed success rates. but only those people can actually go there and stay there. So it deals with migration, and it also creates the Galapagos Marine Reserve. But in 2007, the Galapagos put in the endangered list of the UNESCO, meaning that if the Ecuadorian government doesn't do a better job, they're going to kick them out of the UNESCO list. a few years later is removed from the endangered list, meaning that everything is well and fine with the Galapagos right now, right? You laugh, and some scientists and conservationists also laugh. What are some of the problems that we have right now in the Galapagos? Of course, one of it is population growth. No one really knows the true amount of how many people actually live in the Galapagos, but the census more or less says there's around 30,000 people. So give and take 2,000-3,000 people, but there's probably more than that. But the official number is like 30,000 people, most of them living in Santa Cruz, some of them in Cristobal, and then Isabela and Floreana. There's around 220,000 tourists that visit the Galapagos every year. We're growing more or less at the rate of 6-7% a year. So tourism is growing very fast. It's becoming the main industry of the Galapagos. And there's other things like fishery and all that. So we have a very fast rate of growth. So the town, for example, in Puerto Ayora, which is the main town, has grown very fast. And this is a new picture I just got from the Galapagos. This whole new development is taking place right now. This is called Proyecto Mirador. So this is a huge development, very chaotic, very uncontrolled growth in the Galapagos. So urban growth is very important. More and more connection with the mainland. So before it used to be one ship that, in Cobo's time, it used to be one ship that would come every 6 months. Now there's 5-6 boats that come, cargo boats that come every week. There's maybe in Santa Cruz, there's 2-3 or more flights a day. So there's a lot of boats and airplanes connecting the Galapagos to the mainland, both in social terms, in economic terms, but also in biological terms. That's a big issue. Another thing that's very important today of the Galapagos is a lot of the islands like Santa Cruz and San Cristobal, most of the highlands have been cleared for agriculture. So a huge transformation. These areas now are, some of them are covered with crops. But the problem is that many of these areas now are being abandoned. As people move towards tourism and they are more engaged in tourism, the abandonment of the areas is a huge problem, because in these areas that are being abandoned is exactly there where many of the invasive species that I'll talk briefly about go. So you abandon the area and it seems to be all good, then it's going to go back to, no. This usually turns into an area where a lot of the invasives can go, and it's actually worse. We are finding that's better probably to have cattle farms than to have all covered with raspberry and all the things that I'll talk. Let me briefly talk about fishing, because fishing is a big issue in the Galapagos. So started with this grouper that most people, in Ecuador, we during Easter week, we eat a soup called fanesca, very nice, rich soup. And if you really want to have the real thing, you have to have bacalao from the Galapagos. So all the Ecuadorians during March or so, they start eating bacalao. So the fishermen are fishing this grouper for this big celebration in the mainland. So that's a very early, they dry it and salt it, and then they send it to the mainland. Then they started fishing for lobsters for the external market. And they don't use the nest. What they use, they go diving for the lobsters. So they created this system called the hookah system. Basically, it's a pump that pumps air to a diver, and the diver goes down and they collect the lobsters. So there's 2 species of spiny lobsters that they're doing. There's one slippery lobster that they fish for local consumption, but they are exporting those. But what really changed, so these are the lobsters in the Galapagos, and then we know that this is already doing major ecological changes from, because lobsters, of course, eat sea urchins. When you don't have the lobsters, you have a lot of sea urchins, and they basically create what's called the urchin barns. Basically, they overgraze of the algae that in the rock. So we are afraid that there's already some major ecological changes because of the overfishing of lobsters. But what really changed the Galapagos in many ways were these guys. Sea urchins, sea cucumbers. So no one in Ecuador eats sea cucumbers, but there's a huge market for sea cucumbers in Southeast Asia. So as the economies of Southeast Asia were moving, and we're talking now about 1992, 1993, you know, you have here in the States, you have the California gold rush. In the Galapagos, we have the sea cucumber rush. So everyone moved to the Galapagos to fish for sea cucumbers, and then you had trouble. Because the park and the station realized that this cannot go on, that this is going to create a huge problem. There was a lot of people migrating to the Galapagos from, not only from Ecuador mainland, but also from Peru, Colombia, to fish for sea cucumber. In one day, and talking about 95, 96, in one day fishing, you could make as much as you can make in a whole month working as a construction worker in the mainland. So, you know, many people were moving to the Galapagos, fish sea cucumbers. and then until the sea cucumber fishery collapsed. But what happened is that the Galapagos National Park tried to control the fisheries, and there was a lot of conflicts in the Galapagos. This is probably one of the worst conflicts we've seen in the Galapagos. In many of these areas, the fishermen were organized in fishing co-ops. And many of these co-ops became political organizations that tried to force the park to allow them to fish more and more and more. There were a couple of issues that were, and still are to some extent, very controversial in Galapagos. One was the sea cucumber fishery, but the other one was also the use of long lines. As you probably know, long lines have a lot of bycatch, and people have stopped local people from fishing with long lines. And that was a major controversy because the fishermen, even today, they want to use long lines in the Galapagos, which is not allowed to do. So there was a lot of strikes, there was a lot of pressure on the park and all that. These are the fishermen of San Cristobal. This is a picture I took when I first went to San Cristobal many years ago. And this is kind of a view of I'm an anthropologist. I like to see how people view the world. So this is the view of the world according to a fisherman at the time. So this is the bad, evil octopus. These are the poor fishermen of the Galapagos that are being killed by the tourism sector, the bad guys, the big tour boats, the NGOs, the Charles Darwin Station, the National Park. They're the big guys, the big mafias, they call them, that don't care about the needs of the local fishermen. They just care about these conservation things, and they don't really take into account the needs of the local fishermen. So they are especially, maybe a little bit less now, but there's a big conflict between the local people and the conservation efforts that are based on this Darwinian idea that the Galapagos has to be conserved for the benefit of science and tourism. So there's a big conflict in the Galapagos to some extent. There was to the point where the Galapagos had to be militarized. The fishermen were trying to kill Lonesome George before he died of natural causes, but they were trying to kill Lonesome George, so they had to militarize the Galapagos. There was a lot of, this is about the 1990s or so. So the 1990s was very important and very conflicted. Another thing that was going on with these big boats, these are big purse-seiners that come from Manta, most of them, in the coast of Ecuador, in the mainland, and they were going to the Galapagos and fishing there with these big nets. And there were, of course, another problem with bycatch, with a lot of animals like sharks and dolphins and many animals being caught on these huge nets, especially dolphins. So in order to stop all of this, they start to regulate the Galapagos marine area. So they created a huge marine reserve. At that time, in the 1998, when this was created, this was considered to be the second or the third largest marine reserve in the world. So they created a baseline that connects all the islands, the outer part of the islands, and then they created a 40 miles kind of line where this reserve. Basically, what this reserve did was they stopped industrial fishing boats from the mainland to coming and fishing. And they also regulated the local fishermen. So nowadays, the local fishermen are regulated. So, and they started to zone the marine reserve. So there's areas where the local fishermen can fish, the red areas. There's areas that are no-take zones. There's areas, the blue areas are for tourism, and the black areas are for multiple use areas around the town. And they started to regulate the local fisheries by looking at the size of the lobsters and the sea cucumber and the sea urchins, by looking at the amount you can catch. And another thing that was interesting was they created a management board were made by different actors. So in the way the Galapagos in the 1990s and early 2000s created all these very interesting management systems. And the management board was made of different people, including the tourism sector, the fishing sector, the Charles Darwin Station, the national park, and decided how much people can fish. And the fishermen were in part participating in these decisions. So it was an interesting system in the 90s. Not the only one, but it was an interesting effort to make management of the reserve co-management with the participation of the local users. So that is quite interesting, I think, in the 1980s. This is just maybe very controversial, and I want to contrast this. In 2016, this was created, the Marine Sanctuary. And this is an area where they say they were going to protect the sharks of the Galapagos. So this was, I think, and I don't have time to go into detail, I can talk a bit more about this, but basically I think that this was more a political thing, a political move on the part of the Ecuadorian government to create this big sanctuary saying that they're going to protect the sharks on this area. It was mostly a symbolic thing because the sharks are already protected in the marine reserve. Sharks, you are not allowed to fish for sharks. So it's a very much a political move, a symbolic move, and a lot of actors, international and local actors, were developed. What is interesting and in a way is sad of this process was that contrary to the creation of the marine reserve in the 1998, this was done without consulting, without having the fishermen involved. So it's kind of something imposed on them. They were very upset. They're very upset because they were never consulted. They were excluded from this area. They never understood the whole zoning system. So it's an interesting thing to compare the old reserve that was created in 1998, where there was a lot of participation of the local fishermen, with these new ones where very little participation was created. So the problem still is here. Shark feeding for soup in Japan and other places in Southeast Asia. Shark fin soup are something you have to have if you have to have a wedding that's worth something. And this is the latest scandal in Ecuador. This happened just some months ago, okay? So a big boat, a Chinese boat, was caught inside the marine reserve. So this has happened. We were just discussing this yesterday with the lawyers, what's the implications. So they got this. Now there's a couple of things that is interesting to know. This Chinese boat, there was a big fleet of boats outside of the Equatorial EE zone, the exclusive economic zone. So we're talking about outside the 200 miles, there was a big fleet of Chinese boats outside of the Ecuadorian EEZ. So these boats were fishing. Now this boat that they got, this is not a fishing boat. This is basically a big refrigerator. This is a huge refrigerator. What they do is they provide this boat with all the fish that they get, and this is where they keep it. So there's not so much a fishing boat. So they got this here crossing the marine reserve, and they put in jail the sailors. They are probably going to have to go 4 years in jail or something like that. And they have captured the boats. There's still the process is going on, so we don't know if it's going to be, how it's going to be solved. I think it's in a couple of weeks they are going to appeal the sentence, and it's still, so this is not a closed issue. But this has created a lot of talks and tensions in Ecuador, whether this was the right thing to do, whether the sentence is, according to the Chinese government, the sentence is too harsh. Some people, local people, NGOs think the sentence is they're too lenient with them. So there's a big controversy still today in Ecuador of what to do with this. And basically, but this is one case, but every now and then they get boats from Ecuador themselves inside the marine reserve. And they just captured one 2 weeks ago. After they captured this one, I think it was a week ago, they captured another one from the mainland of Ecuador, again, inside the marine reserve. So we still have a lot of issues with not only international boats, but also local boats from Ecuador, I mean, national boats coming inside the reserve. And mostly the issue here, sorry, something I forgot to mention, the problem here, what they are getting them for is also for having and storing shark species that are under CITES, how you say? CITES 2. So they have a whale shark, they found whale shark, they found hammerhead, they have silky sharks. So they have a lot of sharks that shouldn't be there. That's one of the issues there. Another issue, another thing we're working with is maybe because many of these animals are migratory, so creating a huge area, a corridor, working with different countries to create this whole Eastern Tropical Pacific corridor connecting different marine reserves. Because the more we look, and we have people doing this research, the more we look, the more we know that many of these animals, like hammerheads, are moving around and they're migratory. So we have to think of them as animals that. Finally, I just want to finish talking a bit about tourism, since that is a major issue. Tourism has been growing very fast, as I mentioned, 220,000 tourists. Not only international tourists, but also national tourists are becoming more and more common in Ecuador. So national tourists, Ecuadorians going to the Galapagos. Tourism more or less accounts for more than 50% of the economy of the Galapagos now, maybe 60%. So tourism is a major driver of the economy of the Galapagos. We're seeing that the number of hotels are growing. So it's not so much there's two types of tourism in the Galapagos. The ones who go to the big vessels, the big cruise boats, and the ones who stays with the local community and stay in the local hotels. is the second one that has been growing very fast in Galapagos. Tourism is relatively well managed when it comes to the sites themselves. I would say that most of those are clearly marked. There's a guide that goes with you. So tourism itself is not impacting directly. I'm not saying not at all, but the impact is, that's not our main concern, let's put it that way. Not the direct impact on the sites is not our main concern. So what are our main concerns of tourism? First of all, there's a lot of conflicts within tourism. There's a lot of fights about tourism conflict quotas. There's a lot of fights and conflict between the large operators, the people, not only the people who own the cruise boats, but also the people from outside the Galapagos who want to build very expensive hotels in the island. So there's a lot of conflict in that sense in the island. And there's so local residents feel that a lot of the money about tourism doesn't stay in the island, but actually leaves and goes somewhere else, goes to Quito, to Guayaquil, or Miami, or Amsterdam, or whatever. So there's kind of, people have been thinking about how to get more of this money to stay, and they have developed some solutions, some projects. Some of them are still controversial also. So the local fishermen want to be more involved with tourism. So they invented this thing that's called, we call it in Spanish, we call it pesca vivencial. Basically, it means go and fish with a fisherman and share a day with them. That was the original idea. But this kind of got distorted into sport fishing. So now, right now, what they do is all these fishermen from around the world, United States, Germany, all of that, they go for the big fish. They go for the billfish. It's supposed to be catch and release, but it's still very controversial. So it's a new activity that's supposed to help the local fishermen, but it's a lot of controversy. Sorry, I can talk a lot about this, but I don't have the time. Another thing that is happening is, this is a good example of another activity fishermen are doing. This is Angel Kimi in San Cristobal with some of our local international students, and he has become a dive master. So some of these fishermen have been trained to become dive masters, and they're taking tourists and students and all that, teaching them how to dive. So that there's a lot of different activities that now fishermen are going into tourism, and they're in a way that providing them with an income outside of fishing. That's to some extent. Other issues in the Galapagos, very briefly, I don't have time now, but energy consumption. Energy consumption is going high and high because of tourism. So tourism has a lot of issues, not only because of the sites and all that, but what we call the indirect effects of tourism. Energy consumption going back. This is what happened in 2001 with a boat called the Jessica. And the Jessica crashed very close to where we have our campus. We didn't have the campus at the time there, fortunately, but the Jessica crashed against the reef. The reef where we are, the bay where we are, is called Wreck Bay. And throughout the last 200 years, there's been a lot of ships crashing against that reef. And the Jessica created a huge oil spill because that was bringing oil, diesel, not only for the local consumption. Most of the energy in the Galapagos, even today, is produced by diesel plants. So that was bringing diesel for the local consumption. There's also alternative energies. And again, I don't have time, but there's also alternative energies, but still most of the fuel, most of the energy is produced by diesel plants. So, but also it was bringing energy for a couple of large tour boats, these cruise liners. So the crash created a huge oil spill that affected many islands. It affected Santa Fe, sea lions, birds, Santa Cruz, parts of Cristobal. Sea lions were dying, birds were dying. So a huge problem that occurred, and could happen again. There's no guarantee that there's not been enough changes for me to tell you this will never happen again. I think it can happen again, unfortunately, and it's happening actually. There's oil spills created by boats crashing, whether there's tankers or just cargo boats or tour boats. Another problem with tourism is the bringing of everything has to be brought to the Galapagos, because the Galapagos, really, even agricultural products have to be brought. So there's a lot of cooking. This is for gas, for cooking. There's a lot of cement, beer. There's a lot of beer goes to the Galapagos. So you know, all of these things have to go to the Galapagos. That means that a lot of the species go there. These are invasive species. Invasive species, most of the extinctions in oceanic occurs in oceanic islands, and the Galapagos is no exception. So invasive species, huge problem. I know you have that. I was talking today about the problem here with Eric about the invasive species, but huge problem in the Galapagos. plants, blackberry, guava, guayaba, cinchona, the quinine tree, other trees, goats, donkeys, dogs, cats, rats, chicken, pigeon. A lot of things are going to the Galapagos insects that shouldn't be there, and diseases. So, you know, some of the main ones that we've had are goats, donkeys, pigs, rats, cats, and dogs. Let me briefly describe. So there's also been success stories in the Galapagos. So this is what goats can do to you. 20 years overgrazing. This is where the tortoises live. So in the 1990s, there was developed a program that was called the Isabella program that was also in other islands. It was basically to eradicate the goats. So they took the goats, usually females on heat, and they put a tracking device, and then they took hunters on foot, on horses, and eventually with helicopters, and they eliminated the goats. It was called the Judas Goat Eradication Program because this goat was always betraying its friend. So they killed the goats, they put the goat again, goats like to gather with other goats. Very expensive, cost $14–15 million. So it's a very expensive program and was successful in eliminating goats in some of the major islands. Then they brought the tortoises back to breeding centers, and they got some of these have been quite successful, like the Española Island, where tortoises are now back into the island. But basically, one of the things I want to kind of finish with is that many of these programs, eradication programs, are very controversial with the local people. So, for example, the fishermen always say, oh, they spend so much money in saving the tortoises. When we get sick, who cares about that? So many of the local people feel that is unjustified to spend so much money into saving tortoises and animals like that. But then the local people, they don't have a good medical facility in many of the islands. So they feel that this is unfortunate that the governments are spending money in that and not in the people living there. So there's a lot of these hard feelings that the fishermen always tell me, you know, if they would have given us half of that money, we would have gotten rid of all the goats and easier and much faster and end of the problem. So there's always these feelings among the local people that some of these conservation efforts are really not responding to the local needs. Dogs and cats are also very controversial thing. You can see these dogs and cats eating marine iguanas. They eat cats, of course, as you know, kill a lot of the birds and all that. But for the local people, these are pets. So it's a very sensitive issue what to do with the dogs. There's rules and regulations of what you can do with the dogs, but everyone wants to have their dogs. They bring them illegally to the island. They shouldn't be there, but they're still bringing them. So it's a huge, very controversial thing every time they try to eradicate the dogs. Another thing, someone put tilapia in one of the freshwater lakes, and tilapia became a big problem. Apparently now they're gone. Frogs were brought probably on a fruit boat, and now there's the frogs that shouldn't be there. Geckos also arriving. Snakes, we've now detected some snakes in the Galapagos. There's already a species of snakes in the Galapagos, but there's already been some introduced snakes that are there. So there's animal introductions are very difficult to deal with. And basically, I don't see that there's going to be any way to stop this process. Plants, there's around 500 native and endemic plants in the Galapagos, where there's like 750 plants that are going there naturalized. The main one of the main problems is blackberry, mora. It's basically taken over huge areas. In 1 square meter, you can have 7,000 seeds of mora. So it's very difficult to get rid of raspberry in the Galapagos. Guava and other plants are also a huge problem. And trees like cedro, cedrela, and the quinine tree also is spreading like very fast. Diseases. One of the worries that we have, and you probably can talk, this is what you're working with, is diseases, and you probably can talk 2 hours about these or more. But yeah, diseases that are brought, many of them could be brought by dogs. We have some evidence that some of that is going on already, and the distemper, and what are the other ones? Parvovirus, I think, detected parvovirus and leptospira. So animals also, domestic animals can bring all of that. Another thing that's very controversial is that there's no vaccination for poultry. So chickens and mostly is chickens and things are there, and they have not been vaccinated, and they can transmit diseases because many of them are brought from the mainland, and that can be another source for transmission of diseases. So many different possible effects of that. I just want to finish with this guy, Mark Gardner. Mark Gardner was a guy at the Charles Darwin Station. I invited him to one of my classes, and he told me, you know, because the Galapagos have spent a lot of money trying to get rid of raspberry. And he said, and he was the leading guy. He was leading this effort for 20 years. And he comes to my class and he says, you know, if we would have gotten all the money we spent, he's from Australia, if we would have gotten all the money we spent in trying to get rid of raspberry, we would have banned bad beer, and we would have gotten everyone drunk on the team during all those 20 years. We would have achieved exactly the same thing. As 2 weeks later, he was out of the Charles Darwin Station. So Mark Gardner, a very controversial guy, he wants to make a point. But basically what some people are saying is, forget trying to eradicate all the raspberry. Forget trying to eradicate all these invasives. Let's try to make a system, and this is called hybrid ecosystems, novel ecosystems. Very controversial idea, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in these discussions. Very controversial idea, and one of the places where this idea started circulating early on was in the Galapagos. What to do with all these invasive plants and species, and as I say, it's a very controversial idea. Some people like it, some people hated it, and they're still. So basically, just to finish, I want to conclude with this. One of the things that I think that's still going on in the Galapagos is that there's different views of what the islands mean. And there's the international view, the Darwinian view that says that the Galapagos should be conserved for the benefit of science, of external groups like tourists and scientists. And there's the local view who is more like a frontier mentality. They see the Galapagos as a place where they want to make a living, they want to raise their kids, and they feel that they are entitled to that. They feel that they were there before the park, they feel that they were there before the Charles Darwin was created, and these people from the outside, because many people are foreigners, come to tell them what to do with their own island. So that's been a sort of conflict during the years. It's still there. To some extent, this is changing a bit because now with tourism, people feel more that there's something to be gained by conserving the island, but the issues are still there. And of course, there's politicians involved. So there's mayors and the governors and all that, and there's assembly members. And it's very easy to become a politician in the Galapagos if you go and tell the local people, you know, we are against these outsiders that are telling us what to do. The people, and we are with the people, and you get immediately elected to be the mayor or the congressman or something like that. So that doesn't help. But there's all of these issues with different views of the Galapagos and different positions. So there's something I've been writing about and thinking about it a bit about these different constructs of the Galapagos, what it means, what the Galapagos means for different people, and how these different perspectives and views to the end have made it very difficult to manage the Galapagos and have brought all these conflicts and all these issues. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions or comments. Yeah.
Thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. I learned a lot about this today. I'm curious, when you have tourism increase as much as it has, and you say there's a lot of control on what tourists can do and stuff, what is the experience for the tourist? I mean, is it I guess both of them are increasing, right? The cruise ship and the kind of
yeah, more the local tourists. Yeah. So the experience, that's a good point. The experience has been very managed. So the people, especially in those sites where you have, there's some iconic sites in the Galapagos, as everywhere, and everyone wants to go there. So those like Española, Bartolomé, all those areas are closely managed. And now they're making it so that, for example, if you have a 5-day tour, you can, before it used to be that more or less you went wherever you wanted with your boat. Now you can only go there. They set your itinerary very closely. So if you have the Española, you don't have Bartolomé. If you have this, you don't have that. So they're managing also the itinerary of the boats. Before, when I was first going to the Galapagos with students and all that, we can pretty much tell the captain, you know, let's stay here a bit longer. And no, not anymore. You are very closely managed by the park now. They have these vessel monitoring systems where the park knows exactly where you are and they're controlling you. And that's, yeah, I mean, some tourists complain about that. they're trying to, one of the things they're trying to do, and we as a university have been participating in that, a guy at the university has been working with the park, is to make sure that some of these places are not overcrowded, because that's also another issue, that some of these places get overcrowded. So by distributing the tourists around the archipelago, that means that the tourists not always get the best sites. Not everyone gets to go to the top 5 places in Galapagos. But at least that also means that you don't have 200 to 300 people in the same place at the same time, which still happens. But they're trying to manage that a bit. But yeah.
And they must be putting in some limits, right? On
Yeah.
how many boats can be out there.
Yeah, they're putting limits, they're putting dates. So you can go, for example, Española. There's a place where you can see hundreds of thousands of albatrosses, which is a fantastic view. They're mating, fantastic. Everyone wants to go to Española. So you have only 2 hours to be there, and you can either go in the morning or in the afternoon, and then you get out. You have to leave. So they are trying to manage that, but yeah, it's an issue because the Galapagos is getting saturated very fast with tourists. And there's been discussions. There's no actual students always ask me, and how many people can go to the Galapagos? There a limit? We have in Ecuador has not set a limit, a total limit of tourists that can go. What they've done is they have stopped boats from growing. The big cruise boats, they don't allow new ones, but you have corruption. Sorry to say this, but then you have people that are very powerful that sometimes can bring more boats or increase the number of people that stay on the boat. And slowly, even in the boats that are set, you always have things going on that suddenly you see what's going on. This boat was for 50 people, now you have 60 people. What happened? So there's a bit of that. They're trying to stop the number of boats not growing very fast. Yeah.
Are there any islands that people are not allowed to visit?
Yes, they are. One of the best examples, Darwin and Wolf, that I talked about, the vampire finches and all that, that's only a place where you can only go diving. It's one of the best places to go diving in the world. It's among the top 5. You see hundreds and thousands of hammerheads and whale sharks. You can, in a single dive, be with 2, 3, 4 hammerhead whale sharks. But you cannot go on land. So that's restricted. Daphne, the famous island where Peter and Rosemary Grant from Princeton work and they've done all their studies, you are not allowed to. In Isabela, many of the volcanoes, you're not allowed to go. So yeah, large part of the Galapagos are restricted even for tourists. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you, I know scuba diving is a huge, I guess, tourist location. Do you think that has a negative impact on the ecological conservation, or can be helped to promote the conservation?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think scuba diving has a negative impact because the Galapagos, and I'm not saying this because I think, I talk to marine ecologists about these issues and all that, but really study this. But the Galapagos doesn't have a lot of corals, for example. So the reefs are much more resilient. They're not made of corals like in the Caribbean where you just touching them you can be destroyed. So they tend to be a bit, I'm not saying there's no impact, but they tend to be more resilient than other areas. The impact, again, things like scuba diving or tourism in general has to do, I think, more with this thing of more diesel has to come for these boats, more invasive species might come because they bring more tourists on the planes and the ships that bring things for. So I think from what I understand, the scuba diving per se is not a huge concern in the sense of more scuba divers in the island. It's especially in most of the places. There might be some places where that could be a concern, but in more general areas, no. Overcrowding is an issue, so they are trying to regulate so there's not many people going to some places. Yeah.
You said in the Nino 82, 83 that something like 90% of the corals.
Yeah, they told me 95%.
So what's happened since then with the corals?
There's some recovery, depends, and again, I'm not a marine biologist, but depends on the species. So I forgot the technical, the name of some, but there's some recovery in some species, I understand, and we are monitoring them. Like there's a place close to where we are, Punta Pete, and we know that some species are recovering, but many of the species are not. Many of the species are not, and they have not recovered since then. Yeah, it's a major thing. 82, 83 was the biggest El Nino ever.
Is there a requirement for tourist ships coming in or individual tourists to pay something to the local communities?
Yeah.
And is there also a mechanism in place for any research dollars to incorporate both the financial and a participatory way? local communities? Has that been energized as a way to
Okay.
bring local tensions down?
The first part, yes, there's boats do have to pay a fee, but it's not a significant fee. So every year, if you have a tour boat, you have to pay a fee, but it's nothing very important. So we're talking about, I don't know, 30, 40, $50 million boat that has to pay like $1,000, $2,000 a year. So it's not significant related to the operation of that. And the second question was if there is a...
Well, it's kind of the same thing
for researchers.
In other words, do outsiders have to pay to invade local people's lives? Which everywhere that happens, it creates local unrest.
Yeah, no, not researchers. So researchers, it's not an easy process. You have to have a research permit, but there's no significant fee involved with that permit. So you don't have to pay like huge amounts of money to have a research permit.
Has there been a discussion about that, a greater integration?
I haven't heard it with the research permits. One of the things that has been discussed a lot is that every foreigner that goes, unless you are from an Andean country, Colombia, Peru, but every person that comes from the United States or to Europe, they have to pay $100 fee to get into the islands. And they have taught, and there's studies that say that should be increased to $200, $300. So there's some studies, willingness to pay and things like that. And there's people, and every year they say, we're going to increase it. This year we're going to increase it. And then, oh, but the crisis, we cannot increase it. Next year we're going to increase that money. Oh, but we have a crisis, we cannot increase it. So they haven't. But there's been a lot of talk because that fee has been there for at least 10 years, I think. So there has been a lot of talks of increasing that $100 fee that people pay, but actually hasn't happened. And maybe this year they will increase it. But there's studies that say that it will be okay to increase it to $200 or $300 without major concern for the industry. Yeah. So basically, answering your question, no. There has another thing that's very controversial, and the previous president said he was going to do it and never did it, was that many of these tour companies, they pay taxes in the mainland. So they pay taxes, they're based in Quito or Guayaquil, so they're paying taxes in the mainland. They're not paying taxes to the local economy. So they are paying taxes in Quito or Guayaquil, but they're not contributing for the Galapagos resources.
Yeah. On relation to fishing, I noticed in Santa Cruz, for example, that tourism creates a lot of demand for local fish, for the dinners and oceans and these people. But also they rely in very few species, and that's something that couldn't understand very clear. If that's a recent event that the population are used for consumption, can be reduced to depend in that deep fish, what they call wild brujo.
Yeah.
And in the past, more likely there was a high diversity.
Yeah. There's basically, pelagic and demersal fish, and in the demersal fish they started with bacalao, with this one grouper, but as this fishery was kind of in trouble because the bacalao you find up and down to 40 meters or so. As this fishery was kind of in trouble, then they went to the bajos, to the seamounts. And in the seamounts, unfortunately, we don't really know what's going on ecologically there, but they are kind of starting to fish what you're talking about, brujos and camotillo and all that are very deeper, and then they are usually living in the seamounts. And we don't know what's going on ecologically, but yeah. But answering your question, and with the pelagic fish, they only depend on wahoo and tuna and things like that. We've tried with, but I agree with you that they're because of, I don't know, cultural tradition or so, they only depend on so many species. So with WWF and the university, we're trying to do is with the culinary arts department, we're trying to get them to explore other options that are more sustainable. So they go away from this more like the seamounts that don't have to eat. So we're trying to train the chefs and the cooks to have a more, but I agree with you that they have concentrated on few species. And especially in the case of some of those demersal fish, we don't think those fisheries are very sustainable. So we're very worried, especially with the seamounts, because they are going to the seamounts. We don't know what exactly is going on there. And they're really getting a lot of those demersal fish like groupers and the snappers from there. Yeah.
What about the principal utilities like water for the population, for the sewage?
Water. Tough question. Water depends on the island, right? Where Santa Cristobal has a good source of fresh water. relatively to the other animals. Usually, there's no big issue with water. Sometimes there is when it doesn't rain for a while, but usually you have access to fresh water and the soil conditions and all that. Santa Cruz, huge problem with water. Huge problem with water. So basically what they're doing in Santa Cruz is they're getting water from the crevices and they're getting water that's not usually drinkable. So Santa Cruz has a huge problem in Isabela. So fresh water is a big issue in the Galapagos, and there's a very limited amount of water in Santa Cruz, for example. And they're now bringing desalination plants and things like that to try to solve the problem. Now with used water, that's a huge issue. That's a very important issue. So this is a very controversial issue, and we've gotten in trouble because with Chapel Hill, we've been measuring the quality of the water that comes out of those treatment plants. And that's kind of not always the best. So in San Cristobal, they have a treatment plant. To be honest with you, I don't know how much it is used and whether it's used all the time. So they do have the plant, but not always works. And sometimes when it works, it smells very bad. So there's a lot of pressure from the community to stop using the plant also. So that's an issue. Santa Cruz, they have another treatment plant. And as far as I know, they were going to put one in Isabela, but they haven't. So Isabela was from the water. I think that.
And recycling, how is doing?
The water?
No, I mean recycling for trash.
Oh,
I mean, how trash is.
Santa Cruz, both Santa Cruz and San Cristobal recycle garbage, but Santa Cruz does, I think, a better job than Cristobal. I just went to the plant this summer with another guy from the UK who wants to do, he's a garbiologist, he's an archaeologist who studies garbage. So we went to do a study on garbage and garbage use. I don't think San Cristobal has a lot of problems with its system. It was working very well like 5-6 years ago. Now the system is not working very well. One of the issues is that a lot of the boats that come to the Galapagos, they come with products and then they leave the Galapagos, they go empty. And they were supposed to bring all the plastics and all that back to the mainland. I'm not sure that always happens. So they are accumulating a lot of stuff there. And they are not able to get rid of them. So they're doing landfills again. San Cristobal, the system is not, to be honest, I don't think it's working very well. Santa Cruz, supposedly, I haven't been in the plant lately, but supposedly it's still working quite well with Santa Cruz. That's what I heard. Yes.
So Galapagos is a semi-autonomous province. I mean,
that was not a province. I mean, it's kind of is a special province of Ecuador.
Yeah, so it's semi-autonomous. How's that relationship between the central government, which is unitarian, and how they manage things?
So Galapagos, for example, they have a governor. They have a prefecto. You know the word in Spanish. Yeah. So what they have is a governor that's named, is not elected, but is named by the central government. So they have something that's called the Consejo de Gobierno. And the Consejo de Gobierno, which is this entity, is appointed, the guy who manages the Consejo de Gobierno is appointed by the central government. So they don't have elections for that position. Instead of other provinces in Ecuador, el prefecto, you seem to know a bit about Ecuadorian politics, but the prefectos are elected. Galapagos doesn't have that figure. The head of the Galapagos is an appointed person by the central government.
Do they elect any of their officials?
They elect the mayors, and they elect the people who are going to represent them in Congress. So there's two Congress, now they're called assembly members. So there's two assembly members elected in the Galapagos, and there's the 3 mayors. 3 times, yeah. The people who are elected. And the people in the council, the municipal, yeah. Okay, yeah.
So you showed us in those great images that you have how the increase of tourism and the problematics with ecological and local communities and why not. Do you think it's a similar case with the increase of people doing research there and educational institutions kind of building new infrastructure, and why not? What are the engagements in terms of or is there a relation between the tourism increase and this research as well?
Yeah, I think there is, and we're partly part of that. And I think there's a type of tourism, if you want to call that can be called academic tourism, that people, especially young people, go there and they stay there. So yeah, there is an increase in the amount of young people that go to the Galapagos that we have to be aware of and concerned about. this is in defense of maybe the operation we do. I think that you always have to look at the balance of good and bad that some of these. I'm not saying that this doesn't have an effect, and maybe a negative effect also. I think that when you look at the balance, people who are like the students who stay there with local families and who support local economy, that might have more of a positive than a negative effect. Because, for example, the students that we bring to the Galapagos, they stay with local families, they contribute to the local economy. We don't do any of the big cruise boats or any of that. So we feel that in that sense, we contribute to the local economy. And also the university has, because of these international students, is subsidized education for the local people. So we have like 150 local students from the Galapagos who are doing bachelor degrees, both in sustainable resource management, tourism, and also in business administration. So we're trying to provide some of those resources back to the community by providing them very cheap education. I mean, compared to what we charge in Quito, for example, we charge almost nothing in the Galapagos, like $1,000 a year, which is very subsidized. So we're subsidizing the local economy. So you're right, and I thought about this, of course, a lot. And there's no perfect answer. But you have also, because sometimes people say, oh, let's stop tourism to the Galapagos, they're bringing. Yes and no. I mean, you have 30,000 people living in the Galapagos, and tourists provide an alternative. These people are going to go shark finning and sea cucumber fishing and all that if they don't have an alternative. I don't think it's realistic to say, let's bring these 30,000 people back to the mainland. I mean, they're not going to go. They're probably going to go and destroy the island even more if they don't have to. So tourism itself, not only academic tourism, but tourism itself is a mixed bag of things. But if well managed, I think right now, unless somebody comes with a better solution, is the only practical solution that the Galapagos has, as far as I can tell. You know, I mean, well-managed tourism can be a source of income for the local people in a non-destructive way, at least. For example, I have a lot of stories about these local fishermen who become tour guides, right? And they say, you know, before I used to go, I have two stories that I think are very to the point. One guy tell me, you know, I used to go shark finning and I used to kill sharks. This is in Isabela. And he says, but now I don't do it because I go with the tourists and I see these animals and I see how excited the tourists get. So I stopped shark finning. You know, another guy told me once, you know, I used to go shark finning, but now I go home with the fins and my kids are complaining and they say, oh, you're so bad and blah, blah, blah. So there's a bit of a change in mentality in general in the island, which is positive, you know, which in part, not only, but in part is based on tourism and all these conservation agencies and all that. So something to be taken into account. Yeah.
After the invasion of Tibet by China, China was giving incentives to citizens from the mainland to move to Tibet, to relocate there. What about adopting that idea from the Ecuadorian government, giving incentives for people in the Galapagos to leave Galapagos to relocate to the mainland?
Yeah, that could be an idea. I mean, I think, okay, there's a lot of issues with that. First of all, you have to remember that the people in the Galapagos, I didn't say this, but they make twice as much money as in the mainland, right? So right now, at least right now, the policy of the government is actually to subsidize and to have incentives for people to stay in a way. I'm not saying this is good or bad. The other thing is that politically, this is a very sensitive issue. So you can probably say, and the Charles Darwin Station has said this several times, oh, let's move everyone back to the mainland, or let's keep only a couple of islands with people, and then we get rid of the problem. Politically, very sensitive issue. And the other issue that you probably want to think about is what we call social justice, right? Are we to say to these people, you move out, or what type of incentive we can give? So far, no one has really come with a bunch of money to give them to move out, but people have thought about that. If you want to stay in the Galapagos, you have to have a permanent residence permit. Some NGOs have thought, okay, let's buy them this from them and let's subsidize them to do. No one really has come with the money. Maybe at some point there will be somebody who comes with all that money that will be needed. Now, so that's, first of all, there's a social economic issue there with a lot of money. You probably, even if you give them a lot of money, like $200,000 to every person, who won't move even for that amount of money, you know. So there'll be probably, you'll always have people. The other issue is more an ecological issue that I think we have to think. From what I've said, remember that one of the problems with the conservation is when people move away from their farmlands, right? So when you abandon the farms, then you have a bigger issue now, because the invasive species are there. So if you have this raspberry and this guava and all these animals, and people are asked to leave, you have a huge problem in many of these islands with all these invasives growing there. So to what extent you want to remove the people? The other, and so many of the damage is already there, and removing the people may not be the right solution. You know, first of all, may not be possible. Secondly, may not be the right thing to do, believe it or not, because the environments have already been so transformed that by removing people, you may do it worse in some issues, in some cases. I don't know if you agree with that. But
There was something more about the reduction in population.
Not a removing, yeah. People have come out. What they've tried to do is to stop the growth, and they haven't been very successful with that either. So there has been different programs to try to stop the growth, but the growth still there. Not as bad as it was in the 90s, but still there. Yeah. But I agree that there should be ways in which these incentives are created so that people don't move in, because the first thing we have, another thing we have, and this is hard to say, but it's true, what we should start is that because of corruption, sorry to mention this word again, but it is a reality, because of corruption, a lot of people were given permits that shouldn't have a permit to stay in the island. So between the 1998 and even today, there's a lot of people who have these permanent visas that they can stay in the island, and they shouldn't have it. We know that. They say 5,000, 10,000 people who are there illegally, not because they don't have the permit, but because they obtained the permit in illegal ways. So the first thing they should do is to clean that, to get those people out. That should be where I would start, just make sure that everyone who's there at least are legally there, not because they paid somebody to get this permanent visa and they're staying there illegally. So I think that would be a way to start, But to be honest, no one has had the political will, the power to say, we're going to clean that. Everyone says, we're going to do it. But so far, they haven't done it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.